In November 1943, American and Korean soldiers found themselves in their first battle together in the Central Pacific during World War II. The confrontation took place on the fortified Japanese island of Betio in the Tarawa Atoll. After 4 intense and bloody days of combat, American forces succeeded in capturing the island. When the fighting ended, only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers had survived. These Korean workers had helped the Japanese build bunkers, pillboxes, and gun emplacements across the island. While some of the Korean laborers may have joined in the battle, very little is known about the extent of their involvement. What is known, however, is that Korea had been drawn into Japan's war efforts under tragic circumstances. By 1941, Korea had already endured over 3 decades of Japanese colonial rule. The roots of this colonization stretched back even further to the 1870s, when Japan began to debate how to deal with Korea's resistance to acknowledging Emperor Meiji as the legitimate leader of the Japanese Empire. Some Japanese leaders argued for military action, particularly because Korean authorities refused to engage diplomatically with Japan and mistreated Japanese envoys trying to establish formal relations. In 1876, Japan imposed the Treaty of Gangwa on Korea, which gave Japanese citizens extraterritorial rights and opened up 3 Korean ports to Japanese trade. From that point, Japanese influence steadily grew. This influence deepened after the assassination of Queen Min in 1895, an event widely attributed to pro-Japanese forces. The political struggle over control of Korea and northern China intensified tensions between Japan and Russia, which eventually exploded into the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Japan emerged victorious, and in the Treaty of Portsmouth, Russia formally recognized Japan's dominant interests in Korea. Afterward, Japan increased pressure on the Korean monarchy. In 1907, Emperor Gojong was forced to abdicate, and the Crown Prince Sunjong was made regent under Japanese supervision. Despite Gojong's refusal to accept this transition, Sunjong became the last ruler of the centuries-old Joseon dynasty, which had begun in 1392. Japan's grip tightened further in 1910, when the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed. Japanese Minister of War Terauchi Masatake and Korean Prime Minister Yi Wan-yong formalized the annexation. From then on, Korea was governed by a Japanese governor-general who reported directly to Tokyo, and all of them were high-ranking military officers. The occupation was brutal, and widespread resentment followed. In 1919, following the death of Emperor Gojong, Koreans erupted in protest. The March 1st movement saw a public reading of a Declaration of Independence in Seoul, drawing an estimated 2 million people. The Japanese military responded with violence. According to Japanese records, over 8,000 people were arrested, more than 500 were killed, and nearly 1,500 were injured. Korean records report far higher casualties, with more than 46,000 arrested, over 7,500 killed, and nearly 16,000 injured. Despite being officially considered equal subjects under the emperor, Koreans were treated as a conquered people. Until 1921, they were not allowed to publish their own newspapers or form political and intellectual groups. Many who opposed the occupation fled to neighboring regions like Manchuria and parts of Russia. One of the notable resistance groups formed was the Dongnipgun Liberation Army, which carried out guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. In 1932, Japan invaded Manchuria, established the puppet state of Manchukuo, and suppressed many resistance movements, forcing Korean fighters to flee further west or align with communist-backed Russian forces. As Japan plunged into a larger war with China in 1937, the Japanese government enforced policies aimed at fully integrating Korea into the empire. Korea's economy was reorganized to support the war effort, and cultural assimilation intensified. In 1938, Korean teenagers were enlisted as volunteers, and by 1943, they were drafted into the Japanese army. Worship at Shinto shrines was made compulsory, and any effort to maintain Korean national identity was outlawed. Japanese rule became more oppressive in the 1930s as police and military units imposed heavy surveillance and punished dissent harshly. In this environment, most Koreans chose to outwardly support the colonial regime, though some continued to resist in secret. On December 9, 1941, the Korean Provisional Government in exile declared war on both Japan and Nazi Germany. Led by Kim Gu, the Provisional Administration had brought together various Korean resistance factions and formed the Korean Liberation Army, which collaborated with Allied forces in China and Southeast Asia. Alongside them, other Korean units such as the National Revolutionary Army and the People's Liberation Army fought against Japan. Thousands of Koreans volunteered for these resistance movements. One notable group was the Korean Volunteer Army, formed in Yan'an, China, outside the authority of the Korean government in exile. The KVA, created by 1,000 deserters from the Imperial Japanese Army, later entered Manchuria and recruited ethnic Koreans to form the Korean People's Army, a precursor to the military force of North Korea. Not all Koreans resisted. Some high-profile individuals collaborated with the Japanese government. General Hong Sa-ik served in the Imperial Japanese Army, and ethnic Korean official Park Chun-gyum held key political positions in the Japanese wartime administration. Even before formal colonization, Japanese traders had begun settling in Korea for business. By 1910, over 170,000 Japanese lived in Korea, making it the largest population of Japanese speakers outside of Japan at the time. As Japanese men were drafted for military service during World War II, labor shortages at home increased dramatically. Beginning in 1939, the Japanese government began recruiting Koreans to work in Japan. What started as civilian recruitment soon turned into forced labor. Under the national mobilization law, Koreans were compelled to work in Japanese industries and mines, both in Japan and in territories like Manchukuo. By 1942, with the demand for labor escalating, about 670,000 out of the 5.4 million Koreans conscripted for war-related labor were sent directly to Japan, including to places like Karafuto Prefecture, now Sakhalin Island. These conscripts endured brutal conditions, often being forced to work in construction, munitions factories, and coal mines. Many faced grueling hours, insufficient food, unsafe environments, and widespread abuse. Between 1939 and 1945, it is estimated that around 60,000 of these forced Korean laborers died due to the harsh working conditions and mistreatment they suffered during Japan's wartime mobilization. The suffering of the Korean people under Japanese rule during World War II was immense. Due to harsh treatment, brutal working conditions, and relentless Allied bombing campaigns, the number of Korean slave laborers who died in both Korea and other occupied territories like Manchuria is estimated to be between 270,000 and 810,000. Starting in 1938, Koreans were forcibly drafted into the Japanese military. Although initially portrayed as voluntary enlistment, many were coerced or had little choice. Among the early Korean military figures was Crown Prince Uemin, who reached the rank of lieutenant general in the Japanese Imperial Army. After the war ended, some Koreans who had served in the Japanese Army transitioned into significant government roles in the newly forming South Korean government. Notable among them were Park Chung-hee, who eventually became president, Chung Il-kwon, who served as prime minister between 1964 and 1970, and Paik Sun-yup, the youngest general in Korean history, who became famous during the Korean War for defending the Pusan perimeter. The early leadership of South Korea's military was deeply influenced by this Japanese military legacy. In fact, the first 10 chiefs of staff of the South Korean Army were all graduates of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. As the Japanese began accepting Korean volunteers into the Manchukuo Army in 1938, they established specialized units like the Gando Special Force, which was tasked with counterinsurgency missions against communist resistance fighters. General Paik Sun-yup, who would later serve prominently in the Korean War, was a member of this force. During the war, Korean laborers were organized into construction units by both Japanese companies and military authorities. These teams were led by Japanese officers and composed of Korean workers who were tasked with building military infrastructure, including fortifications across the Central Pacific Islands. By 1944, as Japan's manpower shortages grew, all Korean men were conscripted into the Japanese military or required to work in the defense industry. Prior to that, around 18,000 Koreans had voluntarily joined the army. But in 1944 alone, over 200,000 were forcibly drafted. Altogether, there were more than 240,000 Koreans in Japanese uniform, and nearly 23,000 of them died in combat. While Korean men were suffering on the battlefields and in forced labor camps, Korean women were enduring a different kind of horror. Under the notorious comfort women system, thousands of Korean women were exploited in Japanese military brothels. Estimates of the total number of comfort women vary from 10,000 to as high as 200,000. Many of these women were kidnapped or deceived with false promises of jobs in factories, only to find themselves enslaved in sexual servitude. This included not just Korean women, but others from across Asia as well. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor marked a dramatic turning point for the Korean people, ending years of uncertainty, but ushering in even more intense suffering. As the war moved into the Central Pacific, American forces encountered Korean laborers within Japanese garrisons. For example, during the U.S. invasion of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, Japanese defenses were strong, with over 2,600 elite naval troops and thousands of laborers, including about 1,200 Koreans, working on fortifications. When the Americans landed, they were met with fierce resistance. Eventually, 105 Koreans were captured, almost all of whom were non-combatant laborers. Captured Korean prisoners of war from battles like Tarawa were transported to Hawaii, where they were held in a camp on Oahu from 1943 to 1945. Located in Honouliuli Gulch, this internment facility was just a few miles west of Pearl Harbor. Before it was designated as Prisoner Compound No. 6, it had been used as an alien internment camp. As the war advanced, U.S. forces took control of the Marshall Islands, discovering more Korean laborers during the invasion of Kwajalein and Roy Namor in early 1944. Of the 3,500 men defending Roy Namor, only 51 survived. At Kwajalein, about 8,000 Japanese troops fought desperately, but fewer than half were combat ready. Nearly 7,900 were killed, and 125 Koreans were captured alongside 105 Japanese soldiers. Tragically, Korea's history with Japan remained entangled even in death. At Japan's Yasukuni Shrine, the Korean laborers who died in the Marshall Islands are still enshrined and honored as Japanese war heroes, which continues to offend many Koreans. When Saipan was captured in the summer of 1944, between 300 and 400 Korean laborers, none of whom were trained for combat, were taken prisoner. Many had been severely wounded with injuries, suggesting brutal abuse by Japanese forces, including beatings and attacks with knives or swords. Some had also been shot during the fighting. Korean laborers were also found on other Pacific battlefields like Peleliu, Guam, and Tinian. In September 1944, the U.S. Marines landed at Peleliu, where over 11,000 workers from Okinawa and Korea were present. The Japanese 14th Infantry Division fought fiercely to defend the island, resulting in a horrific toll. Nearly 1,800 Americans were killed and over 8,000 wounded, while only 202 Japanese soldiers survived the battle. On September 2, 1945, Japan officially surrendered, relinquishing control over Korea and ending its long and brutal colonial rule. Korean prisoners of war held in Hawaii were returned home by December of that year. But the end of the war did not bring peace for everyone. Of the 148 Koreans tried for war crimes, 23 were sentenced to death. Many of those convicted had served as prison guards and were infamous for their cruelty. Justice Bert Reuling, a Dutch judge at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, remarked that Korean guards were often more brutal than their Japanese counterparts. Some Korean guards were also sent to oversee the forced labor of the infamous Burma Railway. The highest-ranking Korean charged after the war was Lieutenant General Hong Sa-duk, who had supervised all Japanese-run detention camps in the Philippines. The Korean people had endured tremendous hardship under Japanese imperial rule. They had been robbed of their culture, language, and identity. Many were left with no choice but to conform and survive. Had Japan's empire not been defeated, it's possible that Korean heritage could have been lost entirely. That is why August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered, is remembered and celebrated as Korean Independence Day.